This is a story of a very evil guy called Albert McInnes. The press dubbed him Mad Albert, but I only ever knew him as Big Abe. He roamed Dalmuir and Clydebank in the 60s and 70s. He was first and foremost a bully, but also a violent sex predator who preyed on young boys, a perversion that would ultimately lead to murder. In October 1980, when I heard that a 15-year-old boy's body had been discovered in waste ground near where my mother lived in Dalmuir West, I was saddened and shocked. A few days later, when I heard that Albert McInnes had been arrested for abduction and murder, I wasn't surprised. Our paths had crossed several times in the late 60s and 70s, and I knew from those brief encounters that he was someone to be avoided. I knew him by his reputation as a thug and a bully before I actually met him. I had that dubious pleasure in late '69 when I was working from the chip shop at the Canal Bridge in Dalmuir, which would later feature in the murder.
I was with my friend Brian Clarkey. Brian knew Abe to talk to, so when we found ourselves in an inevitable collision course with McInnes and his entourage of 4 or 5 younger boys, Brian greeted him and they stopped to talk, whilst his boys continued on towards the chip shop. I stood next to Clarkey and remained silent until Albert seemed to become aware of me, and in his thick, guttural voice, he had a speech impediment, demanded, "Who the fuck is he?" Brian buoyantly assured him that I was one of the good guys, and I helpfully raised my hands in the then unambiguous 2-fingered peace sign, and immediately found myself looking up at Brian and Abe from the vantage point of the pavement, where I was now lying on my back, having been sucker punched by Abe. He simply walked off to join his friends. I saw him in passing a few times after that, but didn't have any direct contact until 1971, when I skipped college on a Thursday afternoon and decided to visit a friend. He owned a single end at 433 Dumbarton Road. I didn't know him that well. He was 4 or 5 years older than me, but he let me and a couple of my pals entertain girls in the flat. I arrived at about 2:30 and knocked on the door. There was no response, and I turned to leave. Then I heard voices and sound of activities, so turned back. At that moment, the door was yanked open violently, and I found myself face to face with a dishevelled and flustered McInnes, who pushed past me and ran down the stairs. I looked back and found Robert wearing only his underpants, closing the door on me, calling, "You can't come in," as he did so. I was astounded and had no desire to enter, leaving perplexed and disturbed. He made another appearance later that year when Clarkey, myself, and another friend were in Dalmuir Park. We'd got hold of some strong cider and were fairly drunk. It was early evening, but still light, and the park was closed. As we sat on the grass at the top of a slope, a couple of guys passed the entry gate, and we, in our inebriation, thought it would be a good idea to regale them with gang slogans. The gang whose name we used was from a rival to the local Dalmuir gang. The guys ran off. Some 20 minutes later, they returned mob-handed. There were now about 10 of them, and they scaled the park gates, heading towards us, breaking branches off trees as they came along, obviously intending to beat us with them. Unperturbed, we spread out and prepared to meet them. Then, to our great relief, one of them recognised Brian, and a tense situation was diffused, and we were all pals. However, as we all stood there exchanging pleasantries, another mob was seen running towards the park. This group was led by none other than Albert McInnes. On seeing Abe, the leader of the first group suggested that we make ourselves scarce. On this occasion, we didn't hesitate, and we headed to the top of the park, making our escape via the adjoining golf course.
Sometime later, my mother agreed to let me hold a party and to stay over with my brother for the night to give us some privacy. I was delighted and carefully and naively drew up a guest list of about 25. However, even in those pre-social media days, word soon got around and the party got gate crashed big time, and the house was soon filled with loads of people I didn't know. People were dropping acid, and the smell of cannabis was eye-watering. When the doorbell rang again, I was close out by and answered it. Standing on the threshold was Big Abe, with 4 or 5 guys behind him. I immediately slammed the door and ran through to the kitchen to rally the troops, expecting the door to be punted in before I reached help. We gathered and waited, but nothing happened. Armed with a variety of weapons, we congregated in the hall, and the door was pulled open. They were gone. That was a great relief. But shortly after that, the party was raided by the police, who proceeded to clear the house. I was pretty relieved when the house was cleared, and just to add insult to injury, Mother, obviously not trusting in me as much as I thought she might, had decided to come home and was none too pleased at the mess of the place. Just over a year later, I moved from Dalmuir, although my mother stayed, and McInnes disappeared from my consciousness. That was until October 1980. I was then back in Mum's house again and had graduated from university earlier that year. The body of the boy, Gerald McMurray, had been found on parkland at the end of our scheme. The area was mostly grass, but with a small section of woodland between it and the canal, and was locally known as the Coosey. And it was there where we played football on a Sunday afternoon. I read the newspaper reports for this sad event as part of my research, and it became clear to me that they had got much of the detail wrong. Gerald had attended a disco in the St Stephen's Church Hall on the evening of the 10th October. He had been with his girlfriend and another young couple. After the disco, he walked his girlfriend to nearby Dalmuir train station before heading to the chip shop at the Canal Bridge, a 2-minute walk away. That's the same chip shop that featured in my first encounter with Albert 11 years earlier. One paper stated that Gerald was pounced upon by McInnes, who they called Mad Albert, a nickname that I had never heard. It stated that Albert had put his hand over Gerald's mouth and had forced him into the nearby play park and strangled him. The abduction outside the chip shop didn't happen. The distance between the chip shop and the Coosey is around half a mile. Abe was on foot. At that time, on a Friday night, pre-midnight, there would have been a lot of people milling about. Indeed, there were no less than 4 pubs on the route from the chip shop to the Coosey. What really happened can be found in the home addresses of Gerald and Big Abe. Gerald lived at 958 Dumbarton Road, Dalmuir West, and Abe at 58 Canberra Avenue. Gerald's flat, which the papers inaccurately stated he shared with his mum and dad, is located about 100 metres from the Coosey in a part of Dalmuir West which would have been very quiet at the time, being devoid of both shops and pubs. Canberra Avenue runs next to and parallel with that part of Dumbarton Road, and the flats were only about 40 yards apart. I think that it is very likely that Gerald knew or knew of Albert. They were essentially neighbours. I think that McInnes either made contact with Gerald after he left the chip shop and carried out the abduction as they neared Gerald's home, or alternatively, he followed him or stalked him and carried out the initial attack again in the vicinity of Gerald's flat. If Gerald knew or knew of Abe, as seems likely, he would at least have been wary of him. More likely, he was afraid of him. Albert was well known for being unpredictable and violent. It's clear to me that Gerald almost made it to safety. It must have been terrible for him to be forced past his house towards the Coosey. He had abducted and abused a 10-year-old boy in 1973 and had been in court no less than 27 times by October of 1980. On another occasion, he had been involved with another guy in a break-in. They had prized open a window, and as the accomplice started to climb in, Albert pulled the window down on him, trapping him half in and half out. Albert then proceeded to sexually assault him. The attack on Gerald had an additional ingredient. By 1980, Albert had a drink problem and on the night was very drunk. Wherever the assault took place, Albert, 13 years older than his young victim and with a reputation for aggression and violence, would easily have overwhelmed Gerald. Once he'd forced him past his house, hand over his mouth to prevent a cry for help, he was unlikely to bump into pedestrians for the remainder of the short journey to the park, where he would have been well away from prying eyes and free to do as his perverse proclivities determined. Once he completed his assault, he strangled Gerald with his own belt. Sadly, his death would not be the only tragedy. I will come to that later. When Gerald did not return home by Saturday, the alarm was raised and inquiries made of friends and family. Those, of course, proved fruitless, and search began. According to the media, his body was discovered by his father on Sunday evening in Woodland at the edge of the park. He was lying naked next to a partly dug grave. That must have been a harrowing moment. The papers described Gerald as an only son. My research would suggest otherwise. As soon as the body was discovered, a murder investigation began, and because of the sexual element of the crime, Albert McInnes' name came up. The fact that he lived close to the victim put him at the top of the list. By Monday he was being questioned. By Wednesday he had been charged with murder. He pled guilty, at least sparing the family a trial, and was sentenced to life in prison on 18th December. At the time of the murder, I was doing a postgraduate diploma at the university, and my lecturer in criminal procedure was Albert McInnes' solicitor. I left Clydebank not long after that and eventually forgot all about Mad Albert McInnes, as the media called him. Then the internet was born, and it spawned Google, and in 2005, in an absent moment, I did a search against Albert McInnes. To my surprise, I got a hit, but it wasn't what I expected. It was a local newspaper article which indicated that Mad Albert McInnes had been released from Peterhead prison in 2004. The reporter had discovered him, then aged 52, living in an old folks home called Welbeck House in Perth, along with 3 other murderers and a child rapist, and of course a number of old folks. Welbeck House had 21 beds and was being used as a halfway house by the prison service. The small number of residents and their families had no idea that the accommodation was being shared with killers and child molesters. By coincidence, the MSP for the area at the time was Rosanna Cunningham. She and I had worked together in the mid-80s and had been friends. Rosanna vowed to take up the case, but there were no follow-up reports. Although from my knowledge of Rosanna, she would have taken up the case with some vigour. McInnes died from aspiration pneumonia, pending investigation according to the death certificate. He died in a secure unit for people with mental illness at Stob Hill Hospital in 2022. Perhaps unsurprisingly, his death was not registered by a member of his family, but instead by the mortuary manager of the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow. I mentioned that there is a twist in the story, and here it is. When I carried out my research, I discovered a number of errors in the reporting of the case. I've already highlighted several of those. I also discovered that McMurray was not Gerald's birth surname. He was born Gerald Foss. His parents had at some point broke up, and he had been living with his mother and her partner, surname McMurray. That was a surprise, but the next revelation was a shock. He was not, as had been reported, an only son. He had a brother, Frank Foss, who was a year older. Sadly, on 18th August 1985 at 2:45 AM, less than 5 years after Gerald's murder, Brian died in his flat in Allison Street on the south side of Glasgow from a gunshot wound to the head. As I said at the outset, this video is about a very evil man, but it's also about connections. I encountered McInnes on a number of occasions. I knew Beth Miller, one of the jurors who convicted McInnes for abduction and abusing the 10-year-old boy I mentioned earlier. I knew the solicitor who acted for him in respect of the murder of Gerald McMurray, and of course I knew Rosanna Cunningham. But there's another connection to a different set of murders, which only became apparent when I laterally discovered about the death of Gerald's brother. If you walk a little way down Allison Street from number 255, you come to 51. This is a scene of the Allison Street murders. I have connections there too, perhaps the subject of a future video. Thank you for watching. Please like and share.